Right. Hey, everybody. For those who just joined, we're giving everyone a couple more minutes to file in and we will get started. So thank you. Look forward to speaking with everyone. All right, still coming in pretty quickly here. We'll give everyone just another minute because it looks like there's still a good number filing in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Stacy, Melissa, you guys ready to go ahead and get started? Well, I'll kick us off.
Yep, I'm ready if you are.
Sounds great.
Right. Well, first, let me see. Can everyone see my screen? Is that showing up for everybody? All right. Excellent. Well, welcome, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us here today. We are excited to be presenting our third quarterly discussion on how to ensure equitable treatment for borrowers and avoid any perceptions of bias within appraisals. My name's Steve Sussman. I am the Chief Business Development Officer here at NAN. I'll be moderating today's conversation, but really the stars of the show here are with us, and that's Stacey Caprioli and Melissa Malpass. And just to offer a brief introduction, Stacey Caprioli is Chief Appraiser here at NAN. She is a certified residential appraiser and licensed real estate agent. She's got more than 15 years of experience in the industry, so a great source of knowledge. Melissa Malpass, consumer finance and fair lending attorney at Alston & Bird. Melissa advises financial institutions on all sorts of matters, ranging from truth in lending to RESPA to Title IX of the Dodd-Frank Act. She's represented lenders and appraisal management companies in federal investigations brought under the Fair Housing Act. So great source of knowledge here as well for different perspectives, understanding some of the challenges that are happening currently in the industry as it relates to concerns about equitable treatment and about bias. Now, we got a lot to cover today. I want to first acknowledge something that I try to share at the beginning of each of these conversations, and that is that the topics that we're here to discuss at these quarterly webinars, they often bring out strong feelings on all sides of the conversation, right? From communities who may feel affected by bias, to lenders who are concerned about public perceptions and liability, to appraisers who can feel outright insulted sometimes, even in the insinuation of bias in their work. It is understandable that emotions can sometimes run high. Our view here at NAN is that all viewpoints should be welcome. We want to hear if you agree, if you disagree, if you have something to add to the conversation. The only thing that we ask here is, while we welcome spirited discussion, we just ask that any questions, comments, feedback, if you can put those into the chat for us so that it gives me a chance as the moderator to kind of work them into the conversation. And B, as always, if we could please keep it civil, keep it professional and productive. A reminder, we are ultimately all on the same team here. I think we can say confidently we all share the same objective of delivering honest, accurate, unbiased valuations, right? So understanding that there can most certainly be some disagreements along the way. Let's keep the big picture in mind, and let's keep the dialogue open. Like I said, I want to hear from everybody, all viewpoints. If you just go ahead and type those into the chat along the way, I will be sure to make sure our moderators receive those questions. So let's talk about what we're here to do today. And it's a number of things, right? So first, I want to make sure we share feedback that we've received, and that's Stacy, Melissa, myself, from the lending community regarding updated standards from underwriting for commentary within appraisals, working to make sure there's no perception of bias. And understand that word perception, because intentional bias, we believe, is a very, very small piece of the problem, right? It is that unintentional, perceived, unconscious bias that we really want to be on the lookout for. We want to collaborate. This is not meant to be an instructional conversation as much as it's meant to be a discussion, right? We want to hear from the appraiser community about these evolving standards of what's appropriate within a report and some of the challenges that it may present for you, or what your thoughts are on this continuing evolution. We absolutely want to do our best to educate, as an appraisal management company, and from Melissa, from an attorney, as an attorney, we have a lot of insight into current best practices around subjective language, and how can we help you as the appraisers ensure that fewer revision requests are coming your way, and ensure that there's not even an accusation of bias, that we're so buttoned up and precise in our language that it's very clear that these reports are truly objective reports. And we want to listen. We want to get feedback from you on these changes and hear what you think along the way. What we're not here to do today is really simple. We're not here to vilify the appraiser community in any way. We recognize the vast, vast majority of appraisers are good, decent people who are just trying to provide a service, right? There's no intentions of bias. So everything in this conversation today, understand, is coming with the perspective, with that in mind, that we understand that the appraisers are trying to do the right thing, and we want to do our best to help you continue to be able to do that. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right in. And Melissa, I'm going to start with you. Just as we begin discussing subjective terminology and how it can be perceived as bias, why don't we start from the beginning with a review of the Fair Housing Act and what its requirements are, what its intentions are. Tell us a little bit more about fair housing.
Sure. So I know we've been through a little bit of this before, so this is a good quick refresher, but the Fair Housing Act generally prohibits discrimination in any part of a residential real estate related transaction. So basically in connection with a the sale of a house or the mortgage associated with it. And it's also defined to include the appraisal process. So as a result, an appraisal must comply with the Fair Housing Act, and there are, other counterpart state laws and local laws that kind of, make the Fair Housing Act, and they may add some extra prohibited bases. But for the federal law, no part of the appraisal, analysis, or reporting may be based on any of these bases: race, color, religion, sex, actual or perceived sexual orientation, actual or perceived gender identity, age, actual or perceived marital status, disability, familial status, or national origin. So the appraisal process is included in the realm of residential real estate transactions that the Fair Housing Act covers.
That's great. Thank you, Melissa. And I know we're going to kind of tie this in together today to how this applies to subjective terminology and how that could potentially reflect within the Fair Housing Act. So appreciate you kind of laying out the basics. And Stacy, understanding what Fair Housing Act is, just from an appraiser's perspective, can you share just some general ways to minimize fair housing risk?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. So, obviously we're up against quite a bit with this as a discussion currently. So some of the things that we want to point out to the panel today are that appraisal should never in any way reference a homeowner, the race, the ethnicity, or the protected characteristic of that homeowner in general. Never go into demographic composition of a neighborhood. It's unnecessary within the report. And that appraisals should not use subjective terminology, which we'll discuss in pretty big detail in the next couple of slides. So avoiding statements of pure opinion and descriptions or commentary, steering clear of any of that proxy language or language that could be interpreted to be based on a protected characteristic. And appraisers should avoid that substantive small talk. So off-topic conversations can be incorrectly interpreted as expressing bias. So, that picture right there on the bottom, friendly, but I'm not your friend though. We're there to do a professional service. We're there to be the appraiser. So, making small talk about topics can often lead to larger discussions about fair housing.
And Stacy, when you say avoiding small talk, do you mean even polite things like, hey, nice weather today kind of interactions, or are there more specific types of small talk that you're referring to?
No, I think that, that's just general politeness in a sense, to be greeting your homeowner, being professional about the service that you're providing. I think that the small talk that we would lean towards would be commenting on the decor in a home, or commenting on the choices of construction that maybe that specific homeowner had completed, whether you have an opinion on what they've chosen or not, gearing towards, small talk. We often get reports from members of our panel that there's small talk about ethnicities, or, differing languages that people speak, and that can often lead to some conversations that get misconstrued. So I would say, it's always nice to be polite. Never would tell any appraiser to not be polite and have some basic conversations, but just being very neutral and keeping your opinion about the property and the homeowner out of the talk and the conversation.
Makes sense. Thank you, Stacy. So when we talk about subjective terminology, can you tell us a little bit more about what does that term itself mean, right? Because I've had several appraisers reach out to me since we began promoting this event, and asking me similar versions of the same question, right? And that's, but isn't it our job to provide an opinion of value? Isn't an opinion subjective in and of itself? So what are we referring to here specifically when we talk about subjective terminology? And at the same time, how can well-intentioned appraisers avoid running into trouble?
That's a great question. And I think that the feedback that we're getting from the panel is, justified, that there is some sort of confusion about the opinion of value versus this subjective terminology. So the standards of professional appraisal practice require appraisers to perform their assignments without bias. So what we're saying here is that while the appraisers may not intentionally factor race, gender, or other protected class information as evaluation, some words or phrases can undermine the credibility of the appraisal by implying that demographics influence the outcome. So where we want to have our opinion of value, we want to keep our own personal opinions about the demographics of the neighborhood, the homeowner themselves, any sort of fair housing demographic. We want to keep those away from the report.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. And I know that it can be a fine line, and with these evolving standards, it can be a challenge for the appraiser community sometimes. So I think that, it's important in these conversations that we acknowledge that, and that as things continue to change and evolve, that it's going to create new ways of looking at things that maybe appraisers who've been doing this for a long time may not yet have adapted to. So important to understand just what we mean when we talk about avoiding subjectivity. And it does bring up something important I wanted to call out here as well. Just because something is subjective doesn't mean it's not true, right? And here's use an example for you. Your house is ugly and so's your dog, right? I think we could all probably agree those are true statements when you're looking at these. But just because something is true doesn't mean it belongs in an appraisal report. And it's especially true when it comes to subjective terminology that could be interpreted as bias, right? So it's not enough just for it to be a truthful statement. It's got to clearly be a factual statement, one that is not subjective to the eye of the beholder. Although in this case, I would think maybe factual on that dog on the right. We could pretty much say that is an ugly dog. So Stacy, let me ask you then, when we talk about the agencies and handling prohibited words and phrases, tell me a little bit what's happening now, and also what are we expecting to see in the future? Start with Freddie Mac here. Just kind of what is the latest guidance?
Yeah, the latest guidance from Freddie Mac really came about at the end of June. There you can see June 29th of this year, where it was determined that the collateral advisors are going to include new feedback messages within the UCDP platform. So that meaning when the loan runs through the UCDP, they are now flagging for prohibited words and phrases, which can be caught by the lender, by the AMC on a quality control side. And so they're really looking at those prohibited, subjective, or potentially biased words and phrases that are included in the report. So what that means is that the message is going to be currently displaying as a warning severity, meaning that it will not hard stop against the report. It can still be submitted to the UCDP. It will still come back with a scoring. It will still come back with some sort of, passing through to the TSC. But as we move forward in the beginning of Q4, some of these words and phrases are going to be considered a fatal message, meaning that it'll prevent a successful submission into the status of SSRs in the UCDP, and it will not allow for delivery to Freddie Mac. So having that up front on the AMC side and quality control or the lender side before it can go over to Freddie Mac, those fatal messages will need to be removed in order to mitigate that risk and be able to pass through the system in order to be counted as a successful submission.
So great to know, especially as we get to the Q4 when it can result in that fatal message. And Melissa, what would be some of the words and phrases that may not be immediately obvious, right? Like we know the subjective words and phrases that are just real clear ones that shouldn't be in an appraisal, but what may not be immediately obvious as no longer being acceptable in an appraisal report?
So typically the less obvious ones are, proxies for protected characteristics under fair lending laws. So, you're not actually explicitly referencing race, ethnicity, things like that, but there are words that are subjective that may lead one to believe that there is bias in the report. So for example, use of unsupported or subjective terms without providing a foundation for analysis. So these kind of simple opinion words, high, low, good, bad, we see good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, undesirable neighborhood, things like that. And then incorporating terminology that could be a little bit coded. So pride of ownership is one that is a little bit problematic. What does that mean? Like, what can you say in the commentary instead that would get, that is factual, that would better explain what it is that you're trying to say? Gentrified, and any reference to gentrification is interesting because up to 2016, HUD actually required gentrification to be, specifically addressed in appraisal reports, and whether, whether there is a positive or negative value associated with a neighborhood due to gentrification. So in 2016, that guideline was changed. There wasn't much fanfare about it. It just kind of disappeared. And now it's something that Freddie Mac actually has said, we don't want any references to this. Up and coming, diverse, and even this I found was interesting. This is new from Freddie Mac's guidance. I hadn't seen this before in any other sort of subjective terminology, write-ups out there, and using terms such as millennial, Gen X, or boomers. So, make of that what you will. It's not a racial or ethnic thing, but it is an age thing, and there's really no need to get into that. The idea being you want to describe the property and not describe the people. And I'll just add to the your house is ugly and so's your dog sort of discussion we had earlier. It's just because something is true doesn't mean it needs to go in a report or even in small talk. But we had a client is under investigation. It's a lender, and the appraiser in that case included in the commentary, this house, including the carpet, could really use a professional steam clean. That's what they said in the commentary. And while that may have been true, it really wasn't the place to include that kind of language. basically, the seller's realtor should have told them that, right? Or some other, this should have come up at some other point in the process, but it is not relevant to, it's not something that should be in the report, even though it's not discriminatory, but somebody bringing a complaint is looking for any potential bias, and they see that and they may think, well, this appraiser had it out for me. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, really interesting, Melissa. And you know, that little guy with his head spinning there, that's representative of the appraisers, right? Because you get guidance one way, then the other way. And I would open this up to either to Stacy, Melissa, or both of you here. What do we say to the appraiser community who, you know, when these conversations happen at a government level, at an agency level, there's all sorts of talk about concerns about appraiser bias, but we're not talking about conflicting guidance. We're not talking about quickly evolving standards. So what is the best practice for an appraiser in 2023 to make sure that they are, you know, other than, of course, coming to things like this where we want to try to share the information, but where do we find the most up-to-date information that they would know not to reference Gen X or a baby boomer, or, you know, that gentrification has changed from must-have to now totally unacceptable? How do we be fair to the appraisers at the same time as we try to help the lenders make these changes?
Yeah, I can jump in there. I think that you make a really good point that we're kind of in this, what I would say is a middle ground, where we're getting all of this guidance, but yet we still haven't had a solid kind of determination of where we're going and what we need to do as an appraiser community. And I think that really, when in doubt, I like to say, when in doubt, leave it out. If it does not affect your market value opinion and it is not a factual item, if it is something that you're trying to put your point across into the report and it requires some sort of verbiage that is on the Fannie or Freddie list, or you know, you maybe reach out to your AMC and they might have a list for you. I would say if you are in doubt of whether or not that terminology is going to affect the way that your report is read, leave it out. I can say here at NAN, we have a very extensive list. So if you're ever in a spot where you need to know if you want to put something into the report, it's best to reach out. We can help you and assist you in any way possible to find the best way to word what you're trying to say, while also staying neutral and also keeping anything subjective out of the report. But as I mentioned before, there are some resources through the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac website. We can absolutely release those out and give you some links to those, as well as some larger conversations that are happening across the community, some really great podcasts that are kind of outlining how we just move to the next direction of the way that we prepare our report.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate that. And Melissa, I'm going to dive into the Fannie side of things. Before I do, I wanted to grab a question here from Drew. The question was, is identifying a school district considered prohibitive? So I guess if we're not saying it's a good school district, but we're just saying it's school district number 12, is that okay? Or is that even problematic on a report?
That's a great question. I did see that drop in, and I can just grab it too, just real quick, and then Melissa, if you want to add in. I think that the commentary after it following is really great, that you can reference a school district as a factual item about the property. This property is located in XYZ school district. But again, if you start to take that and determine that this school district specifically is better, quote unquote, than another school district, or if it's prestigious, or if there's an area of concern about this school district that may affect the marketability, you have to keep that to a minimum and keep out that subjective terminology. So really what we want to reiterate is factual basis only. And if it does not have any impact on the marketability of the property, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the report.
Thank you, Stacy. I'm Melissa, and great question. And I want to remind the group, please keep those questions and comments coming. It's so important for us, you know, to understand feedback, not just from the lenders and the agencies that, you know, we pick up, but to hear from the appraisers. How much of this do you hear and it rings true and it makes sense? And how much of this do you hear and you say, this is not right. I'm not okay with this. You know, we want to hear every perspective on it. So please, by all means, keep those comments and questions coming as we continue to go. And Melissa, I know we talked about Freddie first, but on the Fannie side, Are they providing similar guidance on this? Any major differences, or are we seeing kind of the same idea?
I would say it tracks. Fannie's followed suit and has its own words, but really they are one and the same. There may be minor differences, but the underlying point is the same. They have, they also have identified the phrase pride of ownership as an issue, or particularly lack of pride of ownership. Poor neighborhood, good neighborhood, crime-ridden area. Freddie said that too. I don't know how many appraisers are actually writing out crime-ridden area, but any references to crime, I suppose, without some factual support that I don't know if the appraiser would have. So it may be something that is better left out. Desirable neighborhood or location, or undesirable. Those are subjective, and it's just kind of assuming the point without providing any factual support. The higher market values and comps would speak for themselves there.
No, that makes perfect sense. And when we talk about some of these words and terms, Yvonne asked a great question. How do we describe a religious institution, right? If it's a church, if it's a synagogue, if it's a mosque, if it's where, can we say those things directly? Do we talk about it at all? Is there value in a home being located near a religious institution? And if so, can we acknowledge that in appraisal? So what's the guidance on that?
Melissa, I can jump in there too if you'd like. I think that's a really great question. It's one that comes up frequently on our side, especially in the quality control portion. So I think, Steve, you kind of hit it right where it needs to be. The religious institution is a great way to phrase it within a report. However, what I want to just reiterate is that you have to look at whether or not it affects the value of the property and how. So if it's not necessary in the report as some sort of marketable, value impacting item, then it doesn't necessarily need to be there. And and we had talked about this on one of our prior meetings, is that if necessary, you can reference that specific property by name. So if you need to say that it is located by ABC Church, then that is a factual subject to say. But you need to have support for why you're including that in your report. You can also just point it towards the direction of being near a commercial or a mixed-use type property, and compare that to other properties that have commercial influences. So you don't necessarily need to point out that it is specifically a religious facility, just how it impacts your value, whether it be in a positive or negative manner.
Thanks, Stacy. That's a great way to put it. Appreciate that. And Christine has something good here too while we're on the topic, and talking about how the word average is on the list of prohibited words. So when you're talking about materials, when you're trying to, because just being able to describe something is still an important aspect of an appraisal, right? So if something is not average and something is not a good neighborhood and something's not poor, how does an appraiser properly describe a condition without using words like that?
So I guess on the point about average and some of those other, opinion words, good, bad. I think what Fannie and Freddie were trying to say is that you can't describe, you can't overall make this blanket statement about the property or the neighborhood. I think if you get into, below average, material construction or materials, I think that that's a different story, and it doesn't mean that the word average, I should have clarified that, doesn't mean the word average is off the table. But if you're explaining with facts, what it is about the construction or the materials, I think the word averages or below average or above average, those are all fine. I don't know, Stacy, how you feel about that.
We've got you on mute, Stacy. There.
Muted myself. I'm in complete agreement there. I think that it really does depend on the context that the word is being used in, and that's how it's going to be flagged in some of these hard stops or fatal stops. And there may be some ways that we will have to have underwriting decisions override. But I do think that if we're talking about condition of materials, you can always reference your condition rating. That is the best way to come back around and stay away from some of those terminologies, is just point it directly to the UAD definitions for condition and quality.
Thank you,
And,
guys. Appreciate it.
another one is over improvement for the neighborhood. That one can be problematic. We've seen that in some discrimination cases, where, a homeowner might, on a refinance, let's say, might not have gotten the value that they expected. And the appraiser said, well, your home, you put all this into it, but your home is an over improvement for the neighborhood. It's not enough to say that. There needs to be factual support behind it. That's another one that I just thought of that we should, bring up.
Very helpful. Thank you both. So we have the guidance from the agencies, and it sounds like, Stacy, if I kick it back to you here, there's a lot to look out for when it comes to talking about facts and not opinions. Now, I'm going to ask this as a non-appraiser myself, right? Because I try to look at from kind of a common sense perspective, which is a dangerous thing to do in this business, we all know. But things like, if as a home buyer, if it is a high crime neighborhood, that's going to affect how much I want to pay for that home, how much I want to live in that area. So while we have to avoid certain terminologies that could be interpreted as biased, what do we do? How do we describe things so that we still have an understanding of what the surroundings are like and how we would value the home accordingly? How do we do that? What do we do instead of providing that subjective terminology?
Yeah, Steve, I think that's a great way to open up this conversation on this slide. And your title here is exactly what we're looking at, facts, not opinions. So we look at, instead of saying desirable neighborhood, we want to just point out the neighborhood features. You're going to be looking at the items that have any potential impact on value, truly, instead of anything that is an opinion. So, for example, we have newly updated neighborhood swimming pool. That can be a positive impact on the marketability of the property. So just stating some of these things that are more factual than an opinion. And instead of saying crime-ridden area, you can state the facts that come along with that. So you can put out a crime rate in the area is X%, keep it objective, and it allows for the reader to make their own judgments, because it really is up to one person versus another on what a crime rate is that affects value.
And I think Stacy may have.
Make sure
there you go, Stacy.
I'm here. Yeah. We want to just make sure that we're stating whether the valuation of the property is aligned with the price range of the neighborhood. So giving your CMA data, making sure that you're talking about the marketability, the ranges of sales, and making sure that everything is factual.
So it's not so much that we can't discuss these important aspects of a neighborhood. It's that we have to do it in a way that is clearly objective, fact-based, and doesn't leave any room for interpretation.
Absolutely. I think the big thing here, again, is just facts. If you put it in a neutral way of stating your verbiage, you state the fact directly. And then you also have support. As Melissa had mentioned before, if you're going to put something in your report regarding a condition about something or a neighborhood amenity, have a reason in there why you even included that. What is the reason why it affects value? How does it affect value? And make sure your commentary is strong and neutral there also.
So having that factual support, that's the bottom line, right? It's you can describe anything that needs to be described as long as you can clearly back it up, clearly articulate it. And I know there are some examples here that you had shared, like custom built and over improvement. So pretty much just being able to, if you can refer back to facts and everything you talk about, you're likely going to be okay.
Absolutely. I think the custom built is a really great example that's stating the materials and what makes it custom built. And, was it a builder item that was added into the contractor budget? Are there things that really truly made it something that was custom to that homeowner that they chose, that is different from other homes in that market and affects marketability? And keeping it neutral, keeping it factual. And the over improvement for the neighborhood, I think Melissa touched on that great. As she was talking about we really have to expand our commentary here and make sure that the reader gets where the facts are supported.
Yeah, and I'll add one issue with
Melissa.
the custom built. There can be disparities in appraisal values, both sort of on the, on the undervaluation side as well as the over. And so one thing with custom built is it's sort of been, generally accepted that if a house is custom built, there is some additional value to that home, almost per se, because it's custom built. I'll tell you, I have a 1989 house that was custom built, and it is a pain because nothing is standard and I can't replace anything. But generally speaking, custom built is a positive thing, and we're trying. I think part of the reason with this guidance from the GSEs and just generally trying to take another look at, appraisal practices to really think why, like what are we saying here makes this, home more valuable? Is it the, the superior materials? Is it, they use this kind of brick or light fixtures or whatever it is, floor plan? It's just kind of to put the facts in there to try to support any increase in value there.
Great point. Thank you, Melissa. And I want to take a couple of questions that I see coming in here. And I also see, Bobby, you've got your hand up. I'm going to come around to you in just a minute here too. But question that came up. So sales in the area sold for less in less. I'm sorry, the sales in an area for less in the immediate area, 1 block around a 7-story low-income building known as the Housing Authority, in which the density is in that area is greater than areas more than a block away. Demographics of the building are the same as the rest of the area. Is it safe to say an adjustment was warranted due to close proximity to the Housing Authority? So can you take that leap? Can you make that assumption in a report, whether this specifically or something like it?
I think Larry actually answered that really accurately in the chat, that it would be reflected in your comp sale price. So if you're selecting comparables in that same market that have the same influence, it will be reflected there. If you start going
Stacy, so I heard the first part. We lost you for just a moment there on the second part. You say if you start going, and then I lost you for. Could you repeat that?
Oh yeah, apologies. I said if you start expanding your search parameters for comparables, that's when you need to start justifying those, location adjustments or anything that's going to go into your report. But really, truly, if you're selecting comparables that are in that same market, it will be reflected in that value.
All right, we're going to have to invite Larry to be on the panel next time then. So we got that one covered. Yep. Thank you.
Come join us, Larry.
And Rob had asked a question too about using terminology like well-maintained, right? We know if something is well-maintained when you see it, but that is a subjective term. So again, how would you go about navigating that?
That's a great question. I think that the term well-maintained really does come back to the condition and quality ratings. It's about how frequently there are updates to that property. So stating the facts, if the kitchen has been updated, if the bathroom has been updated, what was the time frame on that? So really coming back to how that property has been updated and kept, moving forward throughout the years. If it has not, you really just bring it back to that condition rating to be your support.
That's a great point. And again, it comes back down to backing it up with fact, right? And then that's a perfect way to do something like that. If we can talk about the condition, that's going to speak for itself as to what the maintenance is like of the property.
Absolutely.
Just looking at a couple other questions here while we have them up, and I see Martin had asked words like good and average had been listed, and average neighborhood or good condition. Those are used for many, many years to describe general areas. Do you have suggestions more specifically when we're talking about a general area or a home, rather than good or rather than average, that you would use for prescriptive terms?
I think that one's some of these words. But my suggestion is that think of it in a way that you may believe that something is good, but someone else may not. So we really do have to break it down to what is just factual about that neighborhood. Are there specific amenities around the area? Can you get to certain services? Are there things that you can state that are really truly factual without saying the word, this is a good neighborhood? Why is that a good neighborhood in a factual way? And that would be where your basis would come from versus just utilizing that blanket statement. That's what we want to avoid. We want to make sure that everything that's in our report kind of going forward no longer has that kind of gray area of, well, who said it's good and why do they believe it's good? If they want to use that word, we have to have that factual basis behind it.
Got it. Got it. And one more quick one here, and then Bobby, I'd love to hear what you have to say too. Maria had asked, so can you use words like well-maintained if you back it up? If you say well-maintained, as it includes a new roof and a new kitchen and cabinets, or would you just kill off well-maintained completely and just talk about the roof, kitchen, and cabinets?
I would say my preference from a minimizing risk perspective would be to just start, you don't need to say well maintained. You can just say the home has new roof, kitchen cabinets, etc. Given that the condition rating should reflect, how maintained the property is. But I get that some of these things are, these phrases have been around a long time. I don't think it's the end of the world to use the phrase as long as there is descriptive language in the sentence or, surrounding that, the use of that term. We just need to think about whether it's really necessary at all.
Bobby, thank you for your patience. If you want to come off mute here for us, love to hear your question as well.
Thank you. A couple things. I want to circle back to what was presented about actually putting or including crime statistics in a report. I think that's an absolutely terrible idea for anybody to do in an appraisal. Because if you do it for one, you better be doing it for every single neighborhood that you do. Don't give the appearance when you do that you're pointing a finger to that particular area. There's crime in the most affluent neighborhoods. Don't fool yourself. You do not know who's in there, who's doing what. So I would just advise anyone that is a terrible practice. I'd never do it. I would never suggest it. Putting a crime statistic. Our job is not to give them a crime report. That ain't on our list of things to do as an appraiser. So I would never adopt that practice in any of my appraisals. Second thing, real quick, we talked just briefly about the term well-maintained. That term is literally in the UAD definition of terms for C3. I don't understand why that's something that even be an issue going forward if you describe the property as well-maintained. Why have it included in the UAD definition of terms where literally it says the improvements are well-maintained? It's right there in the definition. So I don't know why that term would be something that would be an issue going forward when the language is literally right there in a UAD definition of terms for C3. And I have one final question. The use of the term average market appeal or good market appeal, is that an issue going forward?
So great questions. Let's take them one at a time. And I think on your first point, Bobby, while some may see differently as to whether or not to include certain things, I think you make a great point about consistency is key, right? If it is your philosophy to include this data, doing it at all times, not just to make a point on a given property or given neighborhood, certainly is important, right? But let's get to the question part of it there. And Stacy, Melissa, would you like to dive in with some thoughts on let's start with the notion of well-maintained being something that is actually used as part of a C3 rating. So I guess are we crossing into too much of a good thing? We want to avoid subjective terminology. Is there risk that we work so hard to avoid subjective terminology that we take away from our ability to truly accurately describe properties and conditions?
I think that's a great question, and thank you for raising that, Bobby. I think that what we want to look at is the condition ratings that are prepared for UAD are very specific. So if you rate your property as a C3 and it has that verbiage saying well-maintained in it, leave it at that. It's when we start to develop our addendums and we go into our own opinion of speech inside of our report, which happens quite frequently, where a lot of appraisers will, develop a paragraph about the property itself and what they believe is well maintained. And that is where we start to vary away from that C3 definition. So using the C3 definition is great. We can stay there. We can, that is our fact. But when we start to sway off away from that and create our own sort of opinionated addendum, that's when we run into these issues. That word won't be flagged for the C3 definition. It'll be flagged when we start to go off topic. So it's really, like Steve said, it's about credibility. It's about facts based on, where is that coming from? Why is that word being used? So well maintained within that C3 definition is being used for that developed purpose. But if we start using it elsewhere and for other reasons, that's when we start to have our risk increase a little bit.
Bobby, does that make sense to address that first part of the question?
Yeah, I mean, that's literally how I do mine anyway. It's in the C3 description. I don't go into an extra description after that on the property. It's right there in the C3 description. So I hope you don't forget about the last question I had about average and good market appeal. I'm just curious about that.
No, I think that's also a really great topic to bring forward. I think that as we're using these words, we do have to keep in mind what one person thinks is average versus another. And that's where we start to run our risk, is that I can use the word average and it may have a totally different definition within my context. So when we're writing up our report and we're using those terms, we have to be mindful of how we're describing that and what our basis for that word is. And it's not necessarily about using the word itself, it's about using the word without any factual support. So really having that support behind it is going to be, your best ally in creating a repeatable and defendable outcome.
Yeah, like if, typically a home in that area is on the market for X number of days, right? If that's a factual point that would support, a hot market, versus an average market appeal, that's something that I would say is not problematic to include.
I think, excuse me, I'm sorry for interrupting. I think more or less along the lines where I'm going with this is when you say a property is in an area that has quote unquote good market appeal and you describe that. So for example, here in Atlanta, we have an area called the Atlanta Beltline. Okay. There are people are attracted to that area because of the Beltline. Or if you have a school system area that, yes, people do flock to that area because the educational system there is one that is desirable. Or if you're in an area that is close to public transportation or downtown, or near restaurants, malls, etc. Those things like that increase the appeal of the area is really what I'm describing. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that what we can always come back to is that our comparables speak for us. So if you're doing a substantial job in pulling comparables within the market that are truly comparable to your subject property, your comps will state that for you. So it's really about the facts and using the comparable selection, the adjustments, and your support for your opinion of value. That's what really speaks volumes here, not stating that we believe that it's a desirable school district, but if there are comps surrounding your
Stacy, I'm sorry, we heard comp surrounding and then we lost you for just a moment. Well, it sounds like maybe a few technical difficulties for Stacy. So if we can hang on that one for just a minute here, we can of course continue that piece of the conversation. And I think there's a bunch of other great questions that are continuing to come in. We're going to get to every one of them. There are a couple more items to share though, which may cover some of these questions. So if you guys, by all means, keep them coming, keep sending them in. Let's get through a few more items that we wanted to share about here, and then we'll dive into any questions that are not already answered. Really love the back and forth. Appreciate the interaction here. So please do keep them coming. But while Stacy works on the technical difficulties on that side, Melissa, let me come back to you, because I've heard you talk about the idea of describe the property rather than the people. So can you give me some descriptions of people that we want to look out for as being potentially problematic? What do you mean by that? What should we try to avoid there?
So generally, any discussion of who's moving in, who's moving out, and what their characteristics are is not really necessary to describe the value of the properties. So, sort of on the gentrification lines, but the employment or income level of residents, any cultural or languages, things like that, which I think we've addressed, or foreign birthplaces of residents. But this isn't an exhaustive list, of course, and there are going to be situations where you might want to say something that seems all right, but is the idea, why am I describing, who's moving in, who's moving out, and who lives here? Like that, the idea is, is that really necessary to evaluate, to provide an opinion of value on the property?
That makes sense. Thank you, Melissa. So I guess kind of sometimes less is more. Is that the bottom line here?
Yeah, I mean, you want to have as much factual support as possible, but the only opinion I think on that piece of paper you should try is the opinion of value, right? Everything else should be, factual support that in your judgment is relevant. But
Okay.
Definitely avoiding unnecessary comments either in the report or, if the homeowner happens to be there, having a conversation. And it's hard because it is a people business, and appraisers sometimes will meet with the homeowners, and you want to be civil and nice and small talk. I mean, there's so many times that I engage in small talk and I'm like, why did I say that? But you see these complaints that come in. You know what I mean? Especially after the pandemic, when we were all stuck at home and then we had to rejoin the world. But some of these complaints that come in, the homeowners are just kind of, there's something about the interaction that rubbed them the wrong way, or they thought maybe, this appraiser didn't like me. They said we had a lender, the homeowner had a lot of like African decor, these really cool masks and whatever. And the appraiser just said that the decor was interesting. And I mean, interesting could go either way, but the homeowner didn't really, appreciate that. And then combined with a value that she believed was much lower than what it should have been, that's where, you can face some risk. So, it really could be anything written in the report or anything that happens, that, for example, the steam clean comment that I said earlier, many would agree that that's probably unprofessional. It's not inherently discriminatory, but this is sort of, I saw a comment in here about this isn't about discrimination, but it's about policing language. And it is about discrimination, but very few, this is my little soapbox. So in terms of the appraisal industry and all the players, the GSEs, the lenders, the federal regulators, it's very hard to dismantle or recreate a system. So one thing that the GSEs and others are trying to do is start with the appraisers and the language that they use. And it's sort of a low-hanging fruit to make sure that there's no discriminatory language or any language that somebody could interpret to be that way. And so the more we can stick to factual support and avoid unnecessary comments, the less risk, and we can just focus on supporting the value.
Great point. And I'm going to come back to Stacy to talk about some key takeaways for the appraisers in general, but I got to ask while we're here, because I see some questions and comments in the chat that bring up a good point, and Maria mentioned this here. Are we getting to a point where it becomes a gotcha game more than it becomes about actually trying to avoid bias and discrimination, right? How do we make sure that we don't cross that line? Because so many of these things are clearly well-intentioned, right? But at the same time, we don't want any opportunity for even the perception of bias. Where do the appraisers have a voice to be able to speak up as the GSEs are coming up with these updated guidelines and to be part of that conversation, or do they have a voice? And is there anywhere that we could recommend that the appraisers bring their thoughts, concerns, perspectives to, so that the GSEs can kind of see from all different viewpoints as they're creating this guidance?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Steve. And I think that when you ask about whether or not they have a voice, absolutely. I think that the big key that we want to point out on these panels is that join the conversations and write to your local, legislation and talk to your appraisal boards in your states and, contact your AMCs and make sure that they are supportive of, everything that's going on in the industry. And I see somebody dropped in there, join the National Appraiser Association. That's also a great one. Attend your CE and have conversations with your peers. Those are going to be your greatest impact. I think that as an industry, we struggle when we sit back and we don't voice our concerns to anyone. So it's really about just communicating with one another and getting our opinions out there. I think that that's definitely something that we can do. There's always opportunity when, the GSEs announce initiatives like this or items that come out. They have great things surrounding the Appraiser Diversity Initiative. You can attend any of those events. You can, go into any of their webinars. It's always a great place to get started.
No, that's great, Stacey. And I think that it requires some flexibility on all sides, right? We need the appraiser community to be willing to evolve in some areas so that we really fully do stamp out both actual and perceived bias. And we also need a willing ear from the lender community, from the GSEs, from the politicians even, to be able to listen and to say, okay, here's the intent, let's work together on how we get there. So it's certainly important. And I know it seems sometimes like a one-way street where it's the appraisers who are asked to continually change and evolve, and rightfully so in many instances, but I think it's important that we give voice to all parties here too. So with that though, can you share, Stacey, just, from this whole conversation, and then I'm going to dive back into a few questions here too with our last few minutes, but just some key takeaways. What stands out to you if we were to boil down this whole conversation for how do we protect the appraisers, give best practices to avoid any kind of discrimination or discriminatory practice? How do you put it all together?
Yeah, I think that if we were to just take everything that we talked about today, we really come back to the factual basis of the appraisal report. So avoiding those subjective terminology phrases that we talked about, or when in doubt, reaching out to somebody to help you in rephrasing some of these items to make sure that they are not subjective, limiting your opinions and providing that everything factual behind anything that you state in your report. Commentary should describe the properties, not the people. So I think we're all aware of that as appraisers. We are not there to appraise, the homeowner. We're there to appraise the property. So keep it that way within your written verbiage. Be prepared to remove and revise commentary if problematic language has been detected. This one can be challenging. I suggest just being open to the guidance from underwriters, from quality control at different groups that may come to you and ask for you to reword something, and just be open to that. Be prepared to remove something that may not be in the best interest of your report as it passes through the lender and onto the GSEs. And use certain words or phrases that could result in rejection. So you want to make sure that you're not using anything that is outlined in those Fannie or Freddie guidelines that we talked about, something that might be at one of those fatal stops going forward. We want to make sure that just kind of looking towards the future and rewording our thought process to be more factual.
Really great points, Stacey. Thank you for summing it up. And I know we've hit on a lot of topics. There were a few questions that I did see that we didn't necessarily get to, or that I think could add some value to the conversation. I'd love to put back out to both Stacey and Melissa. And a reminder, anybody else who's got questions, please feel free to type them into the chat here. But one that came up from Larry, and it's something I could kind of put myself in this position as a home buyer, right? I've got school-age kids, and the proximity to not just the school, but a school that is highly ranked academically. You can mention that the school exists. Now, I know you can't say it's a good school just blanketly because you're calling it a good school, but can you say that the school system is ranked number 8 in the state of Tennessee? Like, can you get into that level of detail? Because you would think from a logical perspective, it could impact the value of the home. But is that a bridge too far with the new guidelines?
I think stating the fact of the ranking in the state is acceptable. I don't think you're crossing any line there by saying that it's ranked whatever number it's ranked in the state. It's that when we start to expand on that, where we might have our opinion kind of float into it. But again, I really come back to the fact that if you have comparables in that same market, it will support that. And you have to also remember, as the appraiser, where one buyer or homeowner might have a 10-year-old who has to go to school, you may also have someone who is a little bit older and their children are out of the home, and that's not a factor for them, but they still want to buy in that same neighborhood. So it's about removing kind of your opinion from the matter, and you can absolutely state the rank, but what effect does it have on that opinion of value, and be prepared to support it.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. And Eugene asked a tough question, right? Should we change this from being an opinion of value, since we're trying to stamp out opinion? And I think, Stacy, you were saying earlier that opinion of value is absolutely still valid. We're trying to get rid of opinions about other elements outside of value. But tell me, am I misstating that? Is that kind of the idea?
No, I think you're spot on there, Steve. I've heard this quite a bit, so I hear you on that, Eugene. Where we continually say opinion of value as appraisers. That's the basis of our profession, is we are providing our opinion of value. But what we have to do is just realize that everything that goes into that opinion of value has to have an objective nature to it. And after years and years and years of this profession, we have kind of intertwined some other items into our reports. There might be some MLS verbiage from a realtor that comes and leans in one direction. There might be something about the school district that leans in another direction. And what we're just trying to do as an industry is take out that subjective nature. It's still our opinion of value based on the facts and the data that we're pulling, but we are, removing ourselves from the opinion of that property specifically and what exactly is going to appeal to that buyer.
Well, thank you, Stacy. Appreciate that. I know we're up against the clock here, so I want to thank everybody, first of all, for participating, joining us, the really helpful dialogue back and forth. There's a lot of things still to be discussed and to be threshed out, right? We're trying to provide best practices based on this moment, in August 23rd of 2023. But as you all can see, the guidance is evolving, the best practices are evolving, and that's why it's important that we keep the conversation going. If you have further questions, comments, thoughts, ideas, anything you'd like to share, there's an email address here on this slide, appraisertraining@nan-amc.com. We will welcome to take this conversation offline, to continue the discussion, and to answer anything that we can, or just to hear your perspective. So while we may be up against the clock here today, want you to know that by all means, if you reach out, it's not going to fall on deaf ears. We will have our experts here weigh in and be glad to pick up that discussion. So let me thank you all again. This was the third of our quarterly events. We will have a fourth quarter event to be announced soon, and hope to see all of you here as well, and spread the word to your peers and your friends. Again, it's not just people to come in and nod their heads yes that they agree with everything. We want to hear from you. We want to hear your take, and it helps us to make better decisions going forward from our perspective too. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.